Okay, I am now recording and I will give you permission. So I don't see anything.
It should be down below where it says participants, I think. You click on participants and then you should stop your record button.
Okay, I will pause it.
Yeah.
I will resume recording. So have you got it going now?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, I am here now with Karen Wong. We have figured out how to both record at the same time. So we are mastering this technology. I understand that Zoom is actually a Chinese company that is profiting greatly from the Chinese virus. So, and we're all delighting in using it, and we're learning more and more all the time how to make use of all its features. So it's all good. So Karen Wong is the hostess with the mostest of the Meaning Code channel. And she has been having a lot of wonderful discussions with people, many of which are very high level into all kinds of abstraction. And she is a painter and wonderful thinker in her own right. Karen and I had a conversation a few months ago, and that conversation appears on her channel. And we got to know each other because we're part of the Paul Vanderklay women. And the Paul Vanderklay women have been populating.
A part of the Jordan Peterson women.
And part of the Jordan Peterson women, yeah. But I don't think Jordan Peterson knows we're here, but Paul Vanderklay does.
Yes.
And let's see, Karen and Sevilla King and I both had conversations with Paul, or all had conversations with Paul. And I think there might be, I think Andrea with the bangs, I think I don't know if she started with Paul, but I think she might have started with someone else, although she's had conversations with Paul. So, so we have a lot to owe to Paul Vanderklay for getting us into this space on YouTube and enjoying all of these conversations. When Karen and I last spoke together, she told some of her story. She has quite a story, and we'll put a link to our last conversation together in the show notes for this video, which is going to appear on both of our channels. And Karen has been talking about finding structures of meaning on various levels of reality, all the way from physics to computer code to economics to mystical traditions, including Jewish mystical traditions, and relating it to the things that she's read in Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning, relating it to her own career as an artist. So I'm very delighted that she and I have finally gotten together again. We have been emailing back and forth trying to figure out how we could have a conversation, and the stars have finally aligned for us to do so. So Karen, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. You do a better job of introducing me than I do of introducing myself, because I don't know what I'm doing.
That's like Paul. Somebody asked him what he was up to, and I knew the bottom line was going to be that he was going to say, I don't have any clue.
Yeah, I know what I'm looking for, but I've found some circuitous routes in the journey of what I'm looking for. So it is a delight to talk to you again, Mary. We've been trying to do this for a long time to connect up again. Yeah. What's it like in Georgia right now?
Hot. It has gotten hot. You know, it seems to, around here, it seems to go pretty rapidly from spring into summer right around this time of year. We had a nice wet spring. I've been doing a lot of gardening. I planted some new trees this year. I put in a pawpaw. I'm about to plant, I'm sitting in a bucket outside. I'm about to plant a nectarine tree. I got a fig tree going last year. I've ordered some hazelnuts. They won't come in till the fall. I have my first crop of raspberries. I've already had, for years, I've been growing blueberries and blackberries and all the other just general garden vegetables. So I'm still picking asparagus. I can't believe it. The asparagus bed
It
that,
sounds sort of like going over into the promised land.
yeah.
And
Yeah, my husband dug out a huge asparagus bed. It's 30 feet, it's about 30 feet long and five or 6 feet wide. It's got 3 rows of asparagus. And we had had an asparagus bed in there before, but it had not been dug as deeply as it should, and it had overgrown real badly with grass from our neighbor's yard because it's against the chain link fence. So he redug it. We put in a barricade between the bed and the neighbor's grass, and we planted asparagus there last spring. We didn't pick any last year because you're supposed to let it go for the first year, and this year I can't believe the production. I can't believe that it's that, because it's a spring. It usually comes up, starts in February, and I'm very surprised that we're still getting asparagus all the way into June. It's just amazing. So
well, I think that's one of the, when I think about economics, how computers keep getting cheaper. There's other things that keep getting cheaper. Asparagus keeps getting cheaper because when I was a kid, it was very rare to be able to find asparagus in the supermarket. And when you could, it was extremely expensive. Only rich people could afford asparagus. So my mother loved asparagus. So wherever we lived, didn't matter how long we were going to be there, she always planted an asparagus bed first thing when we got there. So we always had fresh asparagus at my house. But now anybody can have asparagus. You don't have to have an asparagus bed. You can go to the store and buy it. So
yeah, well,
very interesting.
I think the reason why people can buy asparagus and many of the other vegetables that they can buy so cheaply is really because this might be something that we should talk about. There's something that's been on my mind lately, is, we've got this racial situation going on in our country that just seems to just never end. It seems like, just when you think there's been some progress and there's going to be some peace and harmony, some incident will happen and everything will flare up again of all the anger and everything. And, I was thinking about this concept of slavery and whether we're really past having an attitude of slave owners. And I mean, that's never been something that was an attitude in my family because my family was never wealthy. They lived up north. They were pretty poor and very poor farmers, immigrant farmers, never had anything to do with that. But I wonder if there's an attitude that says that I should not have to work hard for what I have in terms of like my food. And it's perfectly okay if someone else works hard and if they're treated badly. Because we have the labor laws that we have in this country to protect people from, how many hours they work, the kinds of working conditions and all. Those labor laws do not apply to agricultural workers. They were carved out of those laws. And their working conditions are often so horrific. And asparagus is one of those things that has to be picked by hand because you can't make a machine that will pick asparagus because of the way it grows. You know how it grows because you have experience with it. You couldn't have a machine go in there and pick it. Maybe at some point when the AI is powerful enough, it could discern the asparagus stalk and pick it. But as of right now, there's no robot, no machine that can harvest it. It's harvested by hand. So So I kind of wonder, we can all go to the store and we can buy asparagus, but it's what cost to human beings that are getting paid almost nothing and living under horrible conditions and working under horrible conditions to provide us with our food. You've had some talks with economists. And you're pretty savvy, and I know you've actually worked in that field, right? Because you've worked in government somewhat. What do you think about this?
I'm not an economist, but I have an interest in economics. And as you were talking, I was trying to reflect back on the history of this whole issue in our country when it started. I seem to remember that we had a lot of strife over this issue back in the 70s and 80s about the issue of, first of all, of whether or not we should have so many immigrant workers in the country, because there were a lot of people way back when who said it's preventing Americans from having jobs. But then there were, I don't remember what era Cesar Chavez was. And his concern was also that he didn't want to bring in so many immigrant workers from outside. He wanted to get better working conditions for the farm laborers that were working inside the United States at that time, if I recall correctly. But I think part of the reason we came to this accommodation of carving out these exemptions was, my memory isn't crystal on this, so anything I say, I'm going to get myself in trouble. I have a suspicion that the exemptions were carved out originally as a way to help people. And all of those things always go bad, the consequences always exceed the intent somehow.
Well,
Things can start out with such great.
how would they help people? How would it help?
Well, okay,
people?
For example, let's take a different example. Let's take the example of child labor laws. We are very concerned, and I agree with the concern about children that are forced to work in factories in other countries, making things cheaply that we buy cheaply. At the same time, we also hear stories, I don't know whether it's true or not, we hear stories that if those children weren't working in those factories, they would be being sold as sex slaves by their families because the families have no means to support them at all. So it's a choice between two very bad options. But there are some places in the world where there are only bad options. Now, what can we do about that as a country? We can lean on those countries and say, you have to change your ways, you have to change your labor laws. And I think we should do that. But if we say, we're no longer going to buy products from you, then they have no place, they have no jobs at all for anybody, then everybody goes down. And I think this is one of the really complicated things about globalism. I don't like globalism. I think it leads to all kinds of bad places. And yet, globalism has raised a lot of people up out of poverty that were in exceedingly difficult circumstances. And I don't believe everything Steven Pinker says, but he has a lot of interesting data that shows that a number of people have been raised up out of poverty in the last 30 years. I mean, Jordan Peterson's always talking about that too. So I think these are just very complex issues where if we look at it only through one lens, then we make a certain decision, and maybe that decision can make us feel good about ourselves. We can feel virtuous because we made that decision. But on the other side, what we're not seeing is the very negative consequences happening. And unless you have all of the information, I don't think you can make good decisions. And most of the time we don't have all of the information because nowadays Nobody can figure out what the truth is. Do you know what the truth is? I try to research all sides of something so that I can understand it. But where do you look for truth nowadays?
Yeah.
Especially in current events.
Yeah.
know.
I guess, I, to some extent, I try and look back at, the Bible talks about that attitude that we should avoid, which is the attitude that, let us do evil that good may result.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, let us do evil that good may result.
Yep.
It's actually, the Bible talks about that as being, like a trap. You always be trapped in evil.
Yeah, you're talking about Romans 6, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember where the passage is. I just remember saying it is St. Paul. I do remember that talking against that, that attitude. So I think I would what made me think about the farm worker situation was somebody was talking online under some video I was watching about COVID-19, and they were talking about people in England being upset because they were flying farm workers in from Romania and Poland to pick the crops. And then as the conversation under the video went on through the YouTube comments, a person talked about, and said, well, they're doing the jobs that English people won't do.
Yeah.
And then some American came on and said, oh, I see, they're the Mexicans of England, And then somebody else came on and said, well, they do the jobs that English people won't do under those kind of conditions and for that amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they were saying English people would do those jobs, if the working conditions were not so horrible and if the money was decent. But if they're living in a country where you can have decent working conditions and get paid decently, then you don't go do that job if you can avoid it. And so the people of England do not harvest their own food. They import harvesters like we do in the United States, importing the Mexicans. And I thought that was interesting because I didn't know that about England. But then someone else just put a comment, I won't repeat the words they used, but it was, it was kind of a little bit strong language, but basically said, any people, any group, any nation that doesn't have the wherewithal to plant and harvest its own food is ultimately done for. And so I kind of think that too, that we said people, you'll hear that statement all the time. These are jobs Americans won't do. That's why we have to bring them in. But when you find out the working conditions, you find out they're exposed to pesticides and herbicides. You find out that they're, they have their living conditions are horrendous. Their hours they work are horrendous. Their pay is pitiful. Then you go, well, that's why. And it doesn't have, agriculture does not have to be managed in that way, unless it's perhaps that we Americans do actually think that, we have the right to eat food that's inexpensive, and we have the right to eat this food and have it be cheap on the backs of those people. And how is that a different attitude than the attitude of a slave owner? That's what I'm pondering.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point. It reminds me back in the late 70s when I lived in Iowa, before I actually got interested in politics, I was introduced to, I think they were videos back in those days. somebody was passing around a video of a farmer who was talking, and he was exceedingly angry. And he was angry about the way farmers were being treated in the United States. And he kind of spooled out what in essence was kind of a, at the time I didn't realize it because I was younger and didn't really know how things worked. It was a very elaborate conspiracy theory. Now, conspiracy theories are sometimes true, usually not, usually not. But it was very compelling. And I decided I was going to lift the flag and help this guy get his word out. So I started having meetings in my house, inviting 5, 6, 10, 12 people to come over and hear this video. And his idea was that what farmers needed was what he called parity. Have you heard of the concept of
Oh,
parity?
yes, yeah. Is that Wendell Berry?
I don't know if it was Wendell Berry at the time, and
Okay.
I have heard some things that Wendell Berry talks about, but I didn't know he talked about parity. But this guy was all about parity, that we should pick a certain time in American history, I don't remember what date he chose, at which farmers were getting a certain amount of money for every bushel of corn, every bushel of soybeans, every pound of meat. And we should adjust that for inflation and make sure that farmers were always paid at least that much for their product. And he said that if farmers were able to have parity, that they would be able to keep the family farm and they wouldn't be pushed off the farms with all the corporate, the big corporate takeovers, which was one of the things that was starting to happen in Iowa. Now, he described why they didn't have parity, and his descriptions of why they didn't have parity got off in the weeds of this big conspiracy theory about this cabal of, I don't know, bankers or somebody who were trying to take over the world and sitting in a back room and making up plans. And I'm a little bit susceptible to conspiracy theories. So I listened to it. It sounded compelling to me at the time. But after that, I did a whole lot of research on my own. I really got into researching. I dug into a lot of things. And then I got elected to the legislature, maybe partly because those people that came and saw the video at my house got very excited and decided to support me. And I had a lot of support because I was quite vocal about things. But one of the things that I saw when I was in the legislature was that government, whether intentionally or not, often sets up very perverse incentives, financial incentives that create ruinous situations. And one of the perverse incentives that they had set up in the years just previous to my coming into the legislature, and I was not able to overturn it, and it probably was at a federal level, which is why I couldn't do anything about it, is this idea that farmers could get a big tax break if they would buy a big piece of equipment. So farmers started buying these big combines and these big planting machines and great big harvesters and great big these massive plow things that would let out their rows. They could do like 40 rows at one time or something. Some of these were smaller farmers, but all they could see was, oh, if I buy this, I can take that off my taxes. But they weren't thinking, yes, and they also have to be making payments on this every month for the next 30 years because these machines are not cheap. But when you give a tax incentive like that, it really drives up the sale of all this big equipment, and all those big equipment manufacturers are making bank like you wouldn't believe. But the farmers are all going bankrupt because the minute there's a downturn and they don't have a good year, maybe their crop is bad because of bad weather, or maybe they've had a bumper crop and in one area and that's affected the price in this other area, and so they're losing money. All of a sudden now you have these farmers going bankrupt, and then the big corporate guys come in and scoop up the farms. Now, is that the result of a conspiracy, or is that the result of a bad policy decision by the government, by those who wanted to help? We're from the government, we're here to help. We're going to give you this big tax break. But this big tax break has these unintended consequences down the road. So it's that kind of thing that I am not at all sure about. Now, on the issue of the immigrant workers coming in, I agree with you about that whole thing. But there's also a little question in the back of my mind. Why do they want to come here? It must be so much worse where they're at that they want to come here. So if we say, and I think we should, we're going to change our laws so that we're going to say, let's raise the rate so that the rate is something that Americans would be willing to work at, and then we can just not have people coming in from outside. What are those people from outside going to do now? Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I don't know enough about that to know the answer to that. But I do know that every decision, you know how Jordan Peterson always says, everything you do matters.
Right.
Every decision we make has consequences. And so we better be darn sure that we've looked at all the variables before we come up with a grand plan and say, I'm going to make the world a better place because I know the right thing, right?
Well,
And
I think it's not a matter, to me, I'm not looking at it like a matter of do you have the people come or not? It's just that whoever you have, whether they're from this country or they're from somewhere else, that, you know, they should have decent wages and decent working conditions and decent housing. And, you know, that they, in other words, that the same rules that apply to the people in the cities that work in the factories in terms of how they're allowed to be used by the factory owner should apply to them out there, because they were originally carved out of the labor standards, but they're still human beings and they're still laboring. Now, what that will do, of course, is that will raise the price of food. But, you know, raising the price of food, I don't think is a bad idea. That's what Wendell Berry means by parity when he talks about parity. What he's talking about is economic parity for the farmers, for the people who work on the land. Has to, in other words, they have to be able to make a living equal to the people who work in the cities and factories. You cannot have a situation where the people, I talked about this in my fourth chicken video, you cannot have a situation where the people who work on the land have to become impoverished in order to feed the people who work in the factories, because people who work in the factories are dependent upon the people who work in the land because they have to eat. So you can't have this extractive attitude that even though we're dependent on you because we have to eat, we're gonna let the guy who owns a factory make a good living. All his workers make a good living, but the people who supply the food that keep them going, they have to live in poverty and they have to work under horrible conditions. So the parity there has to be that you don't insist that the agriculture be at a disadvantage in terms of the kind of living that you can make at it. And that way, if you have that parity, then you have people will stay on the farms and you will have family farms. Because nobody's going to want to farm if they know that what they're looking at is a life where they're going to be driven into poverty by trying to feed other people. So, and that's what Wendell Berry talks about, and that's what he means by parity. And whether that has to be done by price fixing or how it gets done, the point is that it has to be done, because we're not benefiting by cheap food. The cheap food makes it possible for the producers of the processed food to produce their stuff that's not even really food at a very high profit. And then they can use some of that profit, some of those dollars, to run, billions of dollars worth of advertising to get people to buy that food. They can pay millions and millions of dollars to chemists to make that food as addictive as it possibly can be. They can pay for lobbyists who will do things like, for example, protect them from all the consumers who want very explicit and very detailed labeling on the food to know exactly what's in it. And they can spend millions and millions of dollars on lobbyists against the consumer, the people who want the consumer protections and want the labeling. And they have all that money to put into the advertising, to put into the lobbyists, to put into the chemical research to make the food. They have all the money to do that because they're getting the basic product, which is mostly corn and soy, so cheaply. And they're getting that cheaply by driving family farms out of business. So it's a cascade of things that when you get to the end of the cascade, what do you have? You have a population where 70% of the young people are unfit to go into the military because they're obese or they already have some kind of chronic illness. You have a population of the country where already something like 30% of people by age 30 already have metabolic illness or have prediabetes. You have Alzheimer's through the roof, which now they're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes because it's all related to the same stuff. So that's what we end up with. And in the meantime, you have people just pocketing money like crazy off of all of this misery that other people are living under.
Well, let me spool it back just a little bit because I have not studied this issue as much as you have. So you have a lot more answers than I do. So maybe you can help me with this one. In terms of the working conditions, I have heard of some horrendous working conditions, but I've also read, for example, the other day I was reading, and you never know if this is true, but I was reading a post from this guy who was saying that he was trying very hard to make really good conditions for his farm workers because he was concerned about COVID. And so he had, as always, he said, all of my laborers have medical insurance, and he listed off all the things that he did for his laborers and the kind of housing that they had and everything. And I was reflecting on why would he put so much effort into, I hear on the one side that all these big farmers that use immigrant labor are kind of like the evil capitalist guy who's just taking advantage of people. But here's a guy who's really trying to do a good job for his workers. And it made me think about, like my daughter works for a high-tech company. Her company bends over backwards to make the workers happy because they don't want to lose their workers. They want to be a magnet so that good people will come to them. And is it such a thing that the same incentives don't exist in the farm industry? Do farm workers not have any choice at all where they work? Can they only go to the places that treat them badly? Or are there some places that say, hey, come over here, we'll treat you better, you work for us? Do they have options or not?
Well, I'm sure that there are options. How well people know about options and how many of them are under threat that if they complain, they will lose their, ICE will be called on them because they're not legal. They have certain threats all held over them. So, that's a factor. Um, so there's some situation, like being an example. For example, farm workers are not allowed to collective bargain. It's illegal for them to do collective bargaining. They can be fired for attempting to collective bargain. So this is Mark Hyman. Dr. Mark Hyman had the woman. She's the daughter of let's see, Robert Kennedy, on his channel recently, and she's been very involved with this issue. And she gave an example. She said that there were these 10 men living in this one housing unit that was on this farm, and their toilet had broken. So they kept complaining to the farmer that their toilet needed to be repaired. And finally, he got annoyed with their complaining, and he said, he says, I'm not legally required to supply you with housing, go live somewhere else. So they went down the street a couple of miles and they found another place where they could rent some little place to stay. And then they went back to the farmer and they said, the whole group of them went back to the farmer and they said, okay, we found a place to stay, but we're going to need you to supply us with transportation so we can get to the fields. And he looked at them and he said, do you know what you're doing? You're doing collective bargaining. You're all fired. There was another situation that she talked about, and certainly this is not true across the board. It's like you said, everybody's not an evil, slave driver. But this is an actual situation that happened that, you get these situations where people will hang around in these different towns and stuff, and they'll, you've seen this probably, day laborers, they'll
we
hang out.
Yeah, we have them here.
Yeah, they'll hang out and they'll want somebody can come pick them up and take them to work for a day. And this one case where this van pulls up in this area, and this happened to be near a place where there was like housing for guys who were not all that mentally competent, so the people that they picked up, a dozen or 16, whatever it was, people that they picked up and put in the van were all not the brightest people, right? So they put them in a van, and then they drove them, for 5 hours, and they were like, they had no idea where they were going. And I said, we're taking you to this field where you have to work, and here's what you have to do. And they showed them a pair of binoculars and showed them how the pair of binoculars work, and they said, we're going to be watching you all of the time. And it turned out that there was an Audubon Society refuge right next to the farm. So whenever these guys looked around, they saw people with binoculars all the time. And so they were afraid. And so then they were stuck and they were forced to work for a long period of time. I guess ultimately, somebody rescued them or they got away or whatever. But it's these kinds of practices that when you hear them, they just make you sick to your stomach, and you think.
And whoever rescued them then did not bring charges against this.
Well, I think there were actually charges. There have been charges of actual slavery with regard to the farm situation. Charges have been brought of slavery.
That happened with a restaurant here in our area. There was a restaurant owner who actually had a big rig box out in their backyard, and they were taking these workers from the restaurant to the box, locking them up at night, every night, taking them back to the restaurant in the morning, making them work there. I mean, unbelievable.
Right.
Absolute slave labor. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like horrendous. Just can't even believe that kind of stuff goes on. But these people got caught, and hopefully they are spending many years in prison for that behavior.
Yeah. So, so, you know, when I think about this situation, I just ask the question. It's like, I guess that's one of the reasons why I want to produce as much food as I can in my own yard. It's because I don't want to lose touch with how hard it is. You know, it's because it's hard. It's hard work to.
Yeah, I know. When I, in my hippie prepper days, we had the big garden, and we had animals, and we raised everything ourselves. And I remember how much work it is. And Alice Waters, who's
I
not
didn't know who she
from
was.
not very far from here, she started the whole farm to table movement. And
Right.
the where I live in California, that is much more popular. So a lot of food items are not very inexpensive here. We actually pay quite a fair amount for our food, especially
Yeah.
if it's organic, because there are farms in our area where the owners are more personally invested in the work on the farm. But then we also have, we have the big strawberry fields, the big artichoke fields, and a lot of immigrant laborers doing that work. So
Yeah.
yeah, what you're saying is very concerning. I don't really know how to fix that, because if you do price fixing, that usually ends up having the opposite consequence of what you want.
Right.
Because I'm old enough to remember when Nixon decided to freeze the prices, going the other way to keep them from going too high.
Right.
He froze the prices, and we just ended up with black market everywhere. Now, I
Yeah.
don't know what happens when you try to artificially keep prices higher, although I suspect that's what that is what FDR tried to do at
Well,
the
I
beginning.
don't think that you would fix the prices higher. That would be that if you required for the workers to be paid a certain amount, if you required for the workers to be paid well, then that's going to automatically raise the price of food. In other words, if you start at the bottom, you know, and you start with saying workers are going to have to be paid, and they're going to have these working conditions, and they're not going to be exposed to these herbicides and these, you know, they have to be protected from these things that can so badly damage their bodies. Then you automatically raise the cost, of the food, which automatically raises the price of it.
Mm-hmm. So you're just talking about from the bottom side, giving them the same set of rules that everybody else works by.
Exactly.
What do you think is preventing that from happening?
The lobbying on the part of the at big agricultural interests, and on the part of
This
the
has been going on for 40, 50 years, and with different people in power all through those 40, 50 years. So it's obviously not a partisan issue. Something else is going on, right?
well, it's like I said, it's, you know, it's what they, it's the it's the money that's in it. I mean, it's a huge industry. I think it's the biggest industry that we have, the food industry. So the amount of money that's in it allows, you know, the large players, and we know the large players are playing, you know, hardball, because they've been buying up for the past 40 years all the small players. That's why we have like so few meat processing plants and things like that. The big players have bought out all the small ones. And
Mm.
so because they have that enormous amount of power in the market, they have that amount of capital, they have that amount of interest, they can influence the laws and regulations the way
Mhm.
they want. I mean, look how hard the consumer rights people have had to just um, you know, spend years and years fighting them just to get labeling. And even still, the labeling issue is still there. They're still fighting the idea that we should have a right to know what country our food comes from. They don't want to have country of origin labeling, you know,
Mhm.
different things like that. So
What do you think is
anyway,
the
that's
motivation behind that?
the
Not
motivation behind
why,
what.
Well, not wanting people to know what the country of origin is. I mean, that seems eminently sensible. Why?
Because they think that consumers will exercise the right to choose and maybe prefer to buy things that are made in, say, in America or maybe in Canada over, say, China, for example, but they don't want consumers to make that, to have the right to make that choice. So, so they've been fighting. I mean, that's that. It's the same thing with like knowing how much sugar, knowing how many grams of sugar is in something. It took forever for them to get that on the label. To know actually how much sugar there actually is in something.
Yeah, I'm super thankful
Things
for
like
that
that.
one. Yeah. Well, obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be understood about this whole issue of why our food is so cheap. So I'm glad you brought that up so that we could talk about it.
Okay, well, I guess our time is coming to a close because you have
Yeah,
another.
I have somebody else at 5 o'clock, so
So what time is it where you're at? It's nearly 5,
it's
right?
4:55 right now.
Okay.
So.
Well, I'm gonna have to let you go, but I enjoyed talking to you. And so now we've talked about something that's really down on the ground. And next time we'll talk about one of your more abstract abstract things.
Maybe we should talk about chickens.
Oh, sure. Although they're pretty on the ground. There's nothing abstract.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know, but you're the chicken expert.
Unless
So.
you do an abstract painting of a chicken. Now that's a different matter.
Roosters are generally more interesting because they're very colorful, right?
Well, yeah, they tend to be more colorful than the hens, but I don't think they're nearly as useful.
Yeah, they're not useful, but they're prettier. Yeah, you'd never see a work of art that's just a chicken. It's always a rooster.
Yeah, that's true.
Good talking to you, Mary.
All right, Karen, we'll talk again soon.
Okay,
God
bye-bye.
bless. Bye.